right now. Getting the care you need is more important than ever. That's why we're bringing care directly to people no matter where they live. Creating virtual ICU teams that reduce unnecessary hospital transfers, reduce the burden on families, and save lives. Blue Cross and Blue Shield companies, caring for patients wherever they are for the health of America.
Hi, I'm Congresswoman Robin Kelly, Chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust. Thank you for joining my great panel, Petri Dish Politics, Addressing and Moving Beyond Medical Mistrust in the Black Community. I would like to take this time to thank you at home for taking the time to join us for our discussion of this critical issue. I would like to thank our sponsors listed on my background for their support of the Health Brain Trust and the National Minority Equality Forum. As COVID-19 has shown us, politics impacts our health in ways that we often overlook in daily life. But when the world is put on hold by a global pandemic and we see death rates among African Americans that are 4 and 5 times the white death rates, in fact, according to a new study by the Brookings Institute, COVID-19 is the third leading cause of death of African Americans, trailing behind only heart disease and cancer. Much of this can be attributed to the fact that large numbers of Black Americans live in states that have not expanded Medicaid. That is why we must remember, we decide our health at the ballot box. In the coming weeks, our nation will undergo a key step in the fight against COVID-19, vaccine trials. However, because of decades of disturbing mistrust, there is a rightful mistrust of the medical research community by African Americans. As a result, we have very low participation rates in clinical trials, despite the outsized impact of disease on our communities. Additionally, we historically have had low rates of uptake for vaccines, specifically for the flu, but also other vaccines more broadly. These factors show us how critical it is to have this conversation on working to address this ingrained mistrust now more than ever. So let me start by saying thank you for joining us. The COVID-19 pandemic may have changed our logistical plans, but it's not going to change ALC's overall mission, creating a positive impact in our communities for our community. This year's ALC has given us the unique opportunity to show off the best and the brightest ideas, policy and innovations to empower, uplift, and strengthen our communities without having to overcome scheduling conflicts and physical distance. Although I do miss seeing all of you in person. You're here because you're committed to addressing the politics of health so we can all be healthier and live longer, because who doesn't want to do that? So what is the politics of health? We often talk about access to care, Medicare reimbursement and coverage models. But today I want to talk about the root of biomedical innovation, research. As African Americans, we know why many of our family members and neighbors distrust the medical establishment, from syphilis experiments on servicemen at Tuskegee and medical experimentation on mothers and babies to harvesting and profiting from our cells without our knowledge, and many other dark facts from American history. In Congress, we are still fighting to win the Henrietta Lacks, the recognition she and her family deserve for the immeasurable contribution her cells have made to science and our health. While our community rightfully has reason to be suspicious of the medical establishment, things are changing, and we need them to help keep us and our families healthy. The medical and scientific workforces are diversifying, still too slow for my taste, but progress is progress. More and more physicians are focused on medical ethics, and they are working to identify and address inherent biases in healthcare. Since those dark days, new procedures and processes designed to protect people and their families have been implemented. Yes, risk is an inherent part of new and groundbreaking medical innovation. But now, as opposed to the past, it's informed risk, not gross experimentation. There are resources for patients to empower themselves and their families with information and knowledge to direct their own care. Plus, there are now programs to assist with medical care and resulting side effects associated with the research vaccine. You might be thinking, why should I volunteer to be a guinea pig or a lab rat? But to be frank, if we aren't part of the trials, we aren't part of the cures. If we aren't participating in trials, we won't know if some side effects are more common or occur only in African Americans. We won't know if it's less effective in certain individuals with varying genetics or health conditions. I recently spoke to a reporter, and they shared that less than 1% of participants in phase 1 trials for 2 promising vaccines were African American. Under NIH and FDA guidance, a vaccine needs at least 30,000 Americans to participate in phase 3, or the final phase to advance to market. While the agency encourages vaccine makers to recruit a study population with an overrepresentation of minorities, there is no requirement to do so. Without such a requirement and robust parallel community outreach, these trials would likely not be representative of the diversity of our nation. Otherwise, we risk putting forward a vaccine that isn't helpful or actively harmful. We can't afford any blind spots with our vaccines, especially given COVID-19's disproportionate impact on our communities. Considering the huge amount of your federal tax dollars spent on these vaccines, they need to benefit all Americans. If you want to step up, you can find a full listing on the National Institute of Health's website by searching clinical trials or visiting coronaviruspreventionnetwork.org. I'll say that again, coronaviruspreventionnetwork.org. If you aren't able or don't want to participate, I encourage you to be a strong ambassador for the vital importance of clinical trial enrollment, especially now for COVID-19. COVID might be top of mind, but it's only one disease that disproportionately claims the lives of African Americans. HIV, maternal mortality, gun violence, and heart disease claim more African Americans than they should. In fact, African Americans died at higher rates from 8 of the top 10 killers of Americans, including COVID, which is our most pressing battle. There are so many other diseases and disorders that we need more diverse clinical trial participation to defeat. But it's not just enrollment in clinical trials that will help us overcome these obstacles. We must also expand the number of African Americans working in the medical and biomedical research fields. If we have people who look like us, talking to us in our communities, who are from our communities, communicating the importance of our participation, we can start to build trust. In Congress, we have a bill called HIA. This legislation has strong provisions to increase participation in research by African Americans and provisions to recruit a new generation of Black healthcare and research leaders. While we work to get this bill passed in Congress, I encourage you to take the personal step to become an ambassador for clinical trial participation or to participate in one yourself. At this moment, we have the opportunity to end generations of health disparities. We have to break through the barriers of generational mistrust and build a cooperative pipeline for members of our communities to become researchers addressing the health challenges in our communities. And please remember, again, if we aren't part of the trials, we aren't part of the cures. Now, I would like to turn the program over to our moderator, Dr. John Stewart, and I'll give a shout out to the University of Illinois at Chicago, who is the Physician Executive for Oncology Services and Associate Director for Clinical Research for the University of Illinois at Chicago Cancer Center. Dr. Stewart, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. We really, really appreciate it, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Representative Kelly, for the opportunity to moderate this important session titled Petri Dish Politics, Addressing and Moving Beyond Medical Mistrust in the Black Community. The goal of this program is to encourage the Black community to enroll in COVID-19 clinical trials and encourage uptake of an eventual COVID-19 vaccine. According to data from the Centers for Disease Control, African Americans are 2.6 times more likely to be diagnosed with COVID relative to their white counterparts. We're 4.7 times more likely to be hospitalized and 2.1 times more likely to die from a COVID infection. In addition, the approval of remdesivir went through without having adequate numbers of African American patients on that clinical trial. In a piece that was published on the August 27th issue of the New England Journal of Medicine, there was serious consideration around participation in African American patients in these trials. It was clearly highlighted that the past history of mistrust was a very important barrier to participation in these important trials. I have an all-star panel today to help us begin to dissect the underlying issue of mistrust in clinical trials. We have Dr. Harriet Washington, the author of Medical Apartheid, Dr. Stefan Wallace, he's the Director of External Relations and Vaccine and Infectious Disease Division at Fred Hutch, Dr. Dara Richardson Henderson, Chief Patient Officer at Pfizer, and Dr. Barney Graham, the Deputy Director of the Vaccine Research Center at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease at the National Institute of Health. So I'd like to first start with comments by Dr. Graham. Dr. Graham?
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I am a viral immunologist and physician who's been working to develop antiviral vaccines in the laboratory and to evaluate vaccines in clinical trials for almost 35 years. My work was originally motivated by the global HIV pandemic that started when I was in training. I saw the first AIDS patient in Tennessee when I was chief resident at Nashville General Hospital. As you know, HIV has disproportionately affected minority communities. Communicating with and engaging communities of color has been important for successfully developing antiviral drugs and other therapeutics for HIV and AIDS. Overcoming stigma and mistrust were the greatest challenges for conducting HIV-related clinical trials. I've specialized in understanding immunity and pathogenesis for respiratory viruses and have developed vaccines for respiratory syncytial virus and influenza and emerging viruses like Ebola, chikungunya, Zika, and Nipah, and now the coronaviruses. Our laboratory designed the first COVID-19 vaccine to enter clinical trials and was involved in discovering the first monoclonal antibody that entered phase 1 and phase 3 testing in the United States. This work has been done with Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, who's worked with me in the lab to do this work. Mentoring students from underrepresented minorities and sponsoring their advancement has been important to me throughout my career. Achieving racial and ethnic equity in clinical trials for coronavirus medical countermeasures is important for me now. In my opinion, the unprecedented events of the last 7 months caused by the confluence of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic and inescapable consequences of long-standing systemic racism and inequities in healthcare and social injustice have brought us to a critical juncture in America. I believe the magnitude of the crisis, though, is matched by the opportunity for real change. And the question is whether we will step up and take advantage of those opportunities. There are two major problems for lack of diversity in some of the clinical trials that I've been involved in. First is that enrollment is often misincentivized, rewarding speed instead of ideal subject characteristics. The second is lack of trust by minority communities, especially among African Americans in the medical establishment, and for good reasons, as you've heard. This means that more time, effort, and resources are needed to achieve the best demographic mix to arrive at the best answers. An example of how sustained investment of time and resources can change enrollment demographics is the HIV Vaccine Clinical Trials Network that began in 1987. I started one of the founding sites for this at Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee. And as noted, HIV and AIDS is another example in which healthcare disparities had a devastating impact on the Black community. Therefore, it was important for me and others to engage the Black community in recruitment efforts to participate in vaccine trials. Our goal was to match the demographics of the disease, not just the demographics of the population. I don't have time to discuss all the steps we took to accomplish this, but over time, with assistance from heroic individuals like Magic Johnson, who helped destigmatize the disease, local opinion leaders, and sustained efforts on vaccine education from network and NIAID leadership, this has gradually improved over time. However, just as an example of how deep this goes, my wife, who is an African-American physician, first volunteered for one of my vaccine trials just 2 years ago, after 40 years of marriage. It clearly helps to build trust over time, and the same will be needed for coronavirus vaccine trials and future needs. I believe this will require more than just legislative or structural changes in our approach to clinical trials. This needs to be part of a wider effort to address systemic racism in our country. We need new ways of talking about the problems and to begin understanding what type of communication and connection is likely to be the most effective. I have thought about this as the fact versus faith conundrum. There are different ways of knowing something. One is by learning a set of facts using your mind. Another way, though, is experiential, in which you become aware of a larger truth that supersedes the immediate facts, resulting in a belief system. Understanding or modifying belief systems requires a different level of connection and intimacy that takes time to achieve. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you for those wonderful words, Dr. Graham. I look forward to our question and answer session at the conclusion of our presentations. Next, we have Dr. Stefan Wallace. Dr. Wallace.
Hello, and thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this important conversation. Where do I start? Dr. Graham and Congresswoman Kelly have underscored quite a few of the really important factors that brought us here to this conversation today. I'm a research epidemiologist by training, and working with the COVID Prevention Network. I'm also Director of External Relations with the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. And I guess I want to talk about two sort of things that I think are really, really important to the conversation. And that is one, representation. And the second thing I want to talk about is what does it mean to meaningfully engage communities as part of the process? So first, regarding representation, I, as a young person, actually envisioned my life going very different than how it has now. I wanted to be an attorney or a forensic psychologist as a young person. And so public health and more in particular, HIV and infectious diseases was nowhere on my radar. I did a tour of duty in the US Army as a senior paralegal. And after finishing, I completed an undergrad and then moved to Atlanta, where I first learned about the impact that HIV was having in Black communities, and in particular, young Black communities. This was about 20 years ago. My desire to see change happen with respect to how these young Black men and women were being treated, how the conversations were happening around HIV, and how communities were not being engaged in their care and the process of responding to the pandemic or the epidemic, led me to get more involved in HIV and public health at that time. And I've been involved since. Representation is important because I think having people who reflect the population a part of the conversations, a part of the decision-making platforms, a part of driving the policies and systems that ultimately impact our communities are critical. Having people who reflect the population be not just the person sitting at the receptionist desk when we enter a clinic, but also provide clinical care is critical in our communities. Meaningfully engaging communities, in my estimation, does not simply mean providing a service to people and engaging them as consumers, but engaging them as part of the entire process from start to finish. This includes how we think about a response to a public health issue, how we go to plan and strategize that response or responses, as well as how we think about implementing those strategies. And then, of course, how we assess and evaluate those strategies. Having people meaningfully engaged in the process means that we move away from treating communities and people as simply the end users of products and think about how they are truly engaged and invested in these conversations and in these processes. I think about what it means to hear that science and health literacy are still major barriers in our communities. And to me, it's representative of the reality that we have not done enough, and the systems that continue to serve as barriers to our communities continue to exist. Progress has absolutely been made, but we have quite a bit more to go before we can truly see equity with respect to health in Black communities. Systemic racism, implicit bias in the medical establishment still exists. And I think, as my colleagues have said, there is an opportunity here to truly respond to not just the symptoms and the downstream effects of systemic racism, but also to address the root causes. And my concern and consideration is not just that we think about and we work towards addressing those things, but again, we are also meaningfully engaging communities in the process. I look forward to engaging in this conversation further. Thank you.
Dr. Wallace, those were outstanding comments, and we look forward to further dissecting some of those comments during our question and answer session. Our next speaker is Dr. Dara Richardson-Heron. Dr. Richardson-Heron.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stewart. First, let me say also thank you to Representative Kelly and the Congressional Black Caucus for hosting today's important conversation. And for those of you who I haven't yet had a chance to meet or work with, I am Dr. Dara Richardson-Heron, and I have the great honor and responsibility of serving as Pfizer's Chief Patient Officer. I describe myself as a physician by trade and an advocate by choice. I did my medical training at New York University Medical School and Bellevue Hospital, which many of you know is the oldest public hospital in the United States. And when I look back on my career, this was an inflection point because it was at Bellevue where, after many years of studying medicine and academic
Can you hear me?
I actually saw patients, real patients, who, through no fault of their own, presented with late-stage, often incurable diseases simply because they didn't have access to health care. My training was also during the height of the AIDS epidemic, when we had very few treatment options and thousands of people were suffering every day, much like what we're seeing now with COVID-19. And, this experience put me on a 25+ year path to figure out a way to decrease the burden of disease and to connect with and be an advocate with and for patients, particularly those from racial and ethnic communities, many of whom have been historically underserved by our nation's healthcare system, as our other speakers have said. Now, just prior to joining Pfizer, I spent much of my career and most recently my time at National Institutes of Health as the Chief Engagement Officer and Scientific Executive of the All of Us Research Program, which many of you may know a program that is designed to engage 1 million or more individuals to increase diversity in biomedical research and build one of the world's most diverse and most valuable patient databases to help researchers better understand and ultimately eliminate health disparities. And also, very importantly, to ensure that future medical advances benefit people from all backgrounds, not just a select few. And as part of our work, we built trusted, respectful, bi-directional relationships with individuals, with patients, with patient advocacy organizations, leaders of the Divine Nine, faith-based groups, social justice, and other grassroots organizations to make sure that we were partnering with them in a way in which we understood their needs and also amplified their voices. And to the point that was made earlier, we engage these individuals and organizations in our program as our true partners, not just as subjects, but we invited these representatives to serve at the highest levels of our organizational leadership and governance, on our executive and steering committees, our advisory committees, as equal partners with our scientists in the decision-making process for the design and operationalization of our research program, because we knew the importance of making sure that we designed our program in a way that met them where they were, not where we needed them to be. And now in my role at Pfizer, our team knows that equitable and inclusive research design is so vitally important. Indeed, race, environment, ethnicity, culture, age, gender, and zip code, as we all know, can be a factor as it impacts patient health outcomes. And we also know all too well that many individuals have not, as has been described, been sufficiently represented in clinical trials. And, the reasons are multifactorial. They've been discussed. But my discussions with people of color around the nation and what the research shows is that the first 3 reasons are mistrust, mistrust, and mistrust. And here's the problem, though. This underrepresentation makes it difficult for researchers, regulators, and physicians to really understand, as we talked about, the extent to which a medicine or a treatment can actually provide a benefit to diverse sets of the population. And that's not really okay, because I agree with Representative Kelly. If you're not part of the research, you may be left out of the cures. And I have to be honest, advances in medicine are going to move forward with or without us. And I don't know about you, but myself personally, I am a 23-year and counting breast cancer survivor who's alive today because of the grace of God first, but also because of medical advances. And as a physician who has seen far too many of my loved ones, including my mom and dad, leave this earth too soon, I want to benefit from these advances. I don't want to be left out of the cures, and I don't want any of you or my friends or family to be left out either, because at the end of the day, we have to change the narrative. Life-changing breakthroughs in medicine are not going to be possible for our communities without concerted efforts to address the lack of access, first to equitable health care, to make sure we are doing everything we can to build a trust in our communities. And it's not going to be possible without working in close partnerships with individuals and meeting them again where they are. And to that end, and given the unacceptable disparities we are seeing with the COVID-19 pandemic, we at Pfizer are taking steps to do everything we can to facilitate and ensure diversity in the clinical trials for our COVID-19 vaccine candidate, because we want to make sure that our vaccine has been tested and is safe and effective in communities most impacted by COVID. And our activities include, but are certainly not limited to, conducting research in diverse communities where coronavirus is most prevalent. And we're also actively tracking how we and our trial sites are doing in real time when it comes to enrolling participants of color. In partnership with our Multicultural Center of Excellence, which is a group of grassroots organizations, our partners on our front lines, we're developing patient-friendly materials in a variety of languages. And we're critically engaging grassroots patient advocacy groups so that together we can start to rebuild this trust and reach more patients. We also know that individuals from culturally and ethnically diverse backgrounds are more likely to participate in clinical trials if the researchers and the study team are culturally sensitive. They look like them. We've said this over and over, and come from communities of the individuals where the steady recruitment is occurring. So we're working on that as well. And I know you're probably thinking right now, well, that's a whole lot of talk, but what have you done? What have you done for me lately? Well, I'm delighted that you asked, because I am extremely proud to report that as of last week, in fact, our study enrollment is more than 2/3 complete. We have over 20,000 participants, and approximately 25% of the Pfizer COVID-19 participants recruited in the United States are from diverse backgrounds. And let me be more specific. The Pfizer United States trial participation numbers as of last week are 11% Latinx, 8% Black or African American, 5% Asian, and about 0.6% Native American. And given where we are in our nation and our world, I have to tell you, this is an amazing accomplishment of which we are really proud. But even as we celebrate this incredible milestone, we're also well aware that our work isn't done. I mean, at the end of the day, all of these efforts will go a long way towards helping to ensure that the body of clinical knowledge gained from our research efforts will be beneficial for everyone. But while we as an industry work and race toward a vaccine candidate, whether that's our candidate or a different biopharmaceutical candidate, we also have to acknowledge that the battle isn't over just because we have a proven vaccine. I mean, if we build it, there's no guarantee, as we know, that people will come. And just because we have a vaccine, people might not rush out to get it. I mean, only 45% of Americans, adults, currently get vaccinated against the flu each year. And that vaccine has been around each year, for years. And as it relates to the COVID vaccine, and I think Representative Kelly shared this, a recent Gallup poll shows that there as many as 1 in 3 Americans would not get the COVID vaccine. And those numbers are even higher for non-white Americans, with 41% saying they wouldn't get a vaccine. So it's clear that there's a great deal of work that needs to be done now to build trust and uptake of the vaccine when it is eventually made available. But you know what? Despite this hurdle, I continue to wake up every morning determined to do everything in my power to close the long-standing health equity gap, which has resulted in negative outcomes for racially and ethnically diverse communities across the United States and really around the world. And while I, like many of you, are definitely ready to move past our current pandemic, my yearning for a return to normal takes into account the reality that the normal that we are accustomed to is not the state that many Americans, including me, want to return to, especially when it ignores the long-standing disparities in care and access that fall hardest on people of color. Ultimately, progress benefits from and often requires discussion, discourse, and of course, action, which is one of the reasons I'm so excited to be here today. So I just want to thank Representative Kelly again and the Caucus for having me, and I look forward to what I'm sure will be a lively, engaging, and impactful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson-Heron. Those are amazing comments, and we look forward to gaining more from your opinion regarding participation in clinical trials, particularly participatory patterns in the current COVID-19 trials. Finally, we have Harriet Washington, research scholar and author of Medical Apartheid. Ms. Washington.
Thank you. I begin by saying that I have learned a great deal from what people have already said, and I fear I don't have a great deal more to add to it. I'm a writer. My passions include history of medicine and medical ethics. I lecture in bioethics at Columbia. I'm a writer at Harvard Medical Center, where I did my training in medical ethics. And some years before then, I had gone to the School of Public Health there during the height of the AIDS, the early days of the AIDS pandemic. And despite the obvious parallels between pandemics of the past, including HIV disease, as well as the 1918-20 flu, I think it's important, incumbent on us to remember that the vulnerabilities that we're seeing that have led to a greater preponderance of disease in people of color and African Americans are firmly rooted in inequities that are present today. It's today's inequities that have driven this, that have created the fault lines, that have riven the healthcare and the health status in this country. So we look at things like environmental racism, for example. I pointed out in an essay for Nature that every single risk factor for coronavirus 19 is also something that is caused or embedded by environmental racism. So we have medical realities in this country that have fed this inequity. But it's also, I think, really important amid the talk of distrust of the system to bear in mind that when we indulge in non-contextual invocations of mistrust of the system by African Americans, it's not quite accurate. We can't talk about African American mistrust separate from the untrustworthiness of the American healthcare system. That is actually our energy. We have to talk about both of them. We only talk about African American distrust. It's a very subtle form of blaming the victim, as if the invocation of these risks is a product of distrust rather than being a product of the healthcare inequities that you've all fought so long and so hard to remedy. So I think we have to bear both in mind. So among the things that we need to keep in mind as we fight these inequities is the fact that data failures have largely brought us here. Early in the early days of the pandemic, that was the time for us to investigate, by us I mean the CDC and other agencies, to look at the data and realize what was going on. Had we been collecting racial data at that point, we would have recognized far sooner that there was a disparity in the outcomes among people of color, African Americans in particular, and others. We did not realize this for a very long time. We realized it largely as a result of the Congressional Black Caucus healthcare putting pressure on the CDC. And in April 8th, they'd only collected a small amount of the data that they needed to collect. The prevailing mythology that one can capture racial realities from socioeconomic data is a flaw that has caused a lot of problems here. We didn't know what was going on until it was far too late in the game, and now we're playing catch up to arrest them. We can't do that in the future. And we have to recognize that collecting data among race is really important early in the game, not just now as we're devising and chasing vaccines and trying to guarantee that everyone has access to the vaccines. And the other issue I think is really important to speak about is that a lot of the vulnerability are not things that are built into the system. They're not things that are endemic to African American bodies. We're not talking about biological dimorphism here. We're talking about a disparity in access to care. And the fact that African Americans don't have personal physicians at the same rate of whites, the fact that they're not treated the same way as whites, all these things that are so clear to us, but I think are less clear to the American public, who very often read news accounts, listen to doctors, but take away a message that we're talking about some kind of difference in the bodies of African Americans. And this is worsened by the blame the victim mentality that unfortunately emerges sometimes, and that has been a problem when it comes to giving messages to African Americans about maximizing their health. The Surgeon General, I think, well, I won't go into detail about some of these messages, but they have been prevalent. The idea that African Americans have been criticized for not, allegedly, for not embracing proper health care, for not practicing social distancing, when we know that they are not always able to do that they have been vilified for indulging in drinking and smoking and activities like that, which first of all are not more prevalent in African American communities, and second of all are not root causes of the virus. So I think it's really important to maintain this awareness of messages that are being sent tacitly as well as overtly that can interfere with African Americans feeling an equal degree of being cared for by the healthcare system. And I think that also it's important to know the history. I mean, how can we expect healers to address African American objections or concerns about the healthcare system when they're not completely aware of what African Americans have gone through, nor are they necessarily aware of the rich oral history in which abuses and limitations and transgressions have been passed down from generation to generation in many African American families and communities. I think it's really important to do this and to include this kind of education along with literacy education. And I'll save more details for our larger discussion, but knowing the history is very essential. The canon has systematically excluded the experiences of African Americans in the history of medicine. And in my work, I've done my best to remedy that. I'm very happy to see that others have done brilliant work that helps to remedy that. And I think this needs to continue, and it needs to expand, and it needs to be embraced by healers as they discuss the history with African Americans. I've spoken about environmental racism, but I also want to point out that we'll talk about this in detail later, but there are changes in the system that we also need to see go into effect, in my opinion. We need some improvements in the system, and some of these improvements are things that not only don't militate for the best care, but actually erode confidence in the system by African Americans. Things about lacunae in informed consent. We're improving more and more research for which we don't offer informed consent. And although the American public has not been lobbied on this, we have not actually recruited the opinions of Americans about this, we already know that African Americans, as Dr. Clive Callender once said, they presume not to consent. They don't want any erosion in their right of saying yes or no to medical research, and yet that's what we're imposing on people. So between changing that, between making changes in the IRB system, in terms of which clinical trials actually end up being presented to African Americans, all these things are things that, in my opinion, we need to give the general public more participation in, more direct participation in. We're asking them to assume ownership of the research system, to buy into it as subjects. I think we also need to ask them to be active participants in making determinations about what changes are made and what drugs eventually come to be tested and sought approval of. I think that's very, very important. We have to expand that ownership as much as possible if we want to engage the trust of people who will ultimately benefit from vaccines. And the other things I think we can talk about in more detail later, but these are the basic things I'd like to see us include in our discussion, because they are more long-term steps that I think, and I hope, will have import beyond coronavirus 19, but I think they're also essential to helping African Americans actually assume a more active role and a sense of ownership in the healthcare procurement system. Thanks for listening to me.
Thank you, Ms. Washington. Those are outstanding comments and definitely food for thought. We will move on now to our general question and answer session. And after entertaining a couple of questions to the general panel, we will ask specific questions for each of you. Okay. So just in general, how are pharmaceutical companies and government entities instilling trust in the vaccine process, clinical trial process in the Black community? I.e., how are they counteracting the Tuskegee experiments and general medical distrust?
May I address that?
Yes, please.
I'd like to start by saying that the invocation of Tuskegee is a bit problematic. People often invoke Tuskegee as this overburdened icon for American medical research abuses, but in reality, I'm not sure that it is. Dr. Thomas Levis, when he was at Johns Hopkins, did several studies, and several of them indicated that people who had never heard of Tuskegee, African Americans in particular, who had never heard of the Tuskegee study, were more likely to distrust American medical research system. So the distrust, I think, has to do with something far beyond Tuskegee. It has to do with an oral history in which African Americans have passed down a history of research abuses, and I think that's what generates the fears. I speak about this quite frequently, and whenever I speak to audiences, I hear the same questions and the same anecdotes. Someone in their family who had been abused, a belief in their city that it was dangerous to walk the street near certain hospitals because they might be, taken up and used for experimentation. And the problem with the oral history, of course, is that many of the things these people believe are true, but many of them, I think, are exaggerations. I mean, they can sometimes be even worse than the reality. So to invoke Tuskegee is a little bit limiting, I think. I think it's important to understand that there's a more generalized distrust, and it's got, multiple points of generation.
Yeah,
So
I would agree with that.
Sure, Dr. Richardson-Heron? Yes.
Yeah, I would agree that, certainly it's not only Tuskegee, but certainly, a lot of people of color all around the world, in fact, and really, it's actually the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. It wasn't Tuskegee itself. But I think that does play a role. But you're absolutely correct. There are a lot of reasons for people of color to have distrust in the system. But to your original point, Dr. Stewart, about how are pharmaceutical companies addressing, some of the issues of mistrust. As I mentioned before, Pfizer has a long-standing commitment to diversifying clinical trials with the goal of eliminating health disparities in communities that have been historically underrepresented. We really want to ensure that our clinical trial recruitment populations fully represent the disease states that we're studying and also the racial diversity of the environments where we operate. And that's so important. There's so many drugs out there that are being developed, for conditions that impact, people of color that haven't been studied as extensively as they possibly could have been on people of color. So we really are working to do that. And we're really, as I mentioned before, working with patients very early on in the process. We have something that we call end-to-end development or end-to-end partnerships, where we are bringing in participants very, very early on to get their thoughts, to ask them what matters most to them, not, just researchers being in a room making a decision what's best for individuals, but we're also engaging with people who really connect with individuals and communities of colors. For example, we just recently started, working on COVID with 100 Black Men, Council on Black Health, Sisters Working It Out, and the National Black Nurses Association to address, some of these issues that we're talking about right now, to understand what is it that our communities want and how can we best make sure that we are including all of this thinking and providing them with that information that they need to feel more trustful of the system. This is so very important, and you can't do it without actually talking to people. And we're committed to that. Not only that, we're actually making sure that any place we do research, that the site investigators are very clear and aligned with our concerted effort to make sure that their efforts are culturally diverse. They are meeting people where they are, as I said before, not where we want them to be, and providing a precise level of information and also engagement that will hopefully help people feel that there's more trust in the system. So that's just one way that we are impacting, the communities.
So our next question is, can you discuss protocols in place to keep individuals safe if a problem does occur during the clinical trials process? And moreover, how can we empower patients and protect their rights within these trials? Okay, Dr. Richardson-Heron, you're good to answer.
Okay, well, as I mentioned before, safety was and is and always be our #1 priority in vaccine research and development, and quite frankly, in any development. Even though our teams are moving forward with extraordinary speed, preservation of high quality and safety standards is critically important throughout the development. It would not be a service for us to put out a vaccine that was not safe. So for this study, as with all of our clinical trials, participant safety is paramount. And researchers are required to follow very strict rules to make sure that participants are safe. For example, the clinical trial protocol was independently reviewed by the regulatory authorities and approved by institutional review boards. And some of you may know that the role of the institutional review board is to ensure study participants are not exposed to unnecessary risks. That's a requirement now. That has been put in place so that people cannot be taken advantage of as some people have in the past. The trial's progress is closely monitored by both Pfizer as well as an outside group of experts called an External Data Monitoring Committee. And Pfizer would stop the trial if we or the External Data Monitoring Committee found that the vaccine candidate is not working or was harming participants. In addition, the investigators who are experienced in vaccine trials are responsible for monitoring individual participants and their health throughout the trial. And there are planned follow-up visits where the study doctor will monitor participants' health, and participants should also report any changes in their health immediately to the study doctor. And as I mentioned, we've already enrolled up more than 20,000 subjects in the phase 3 of the study. And half of them, of course, are receiving the vaccine and half of them are not. And this, this is a large safety database consistent with other large vaccine efficacy trials and vaccines that have been reviewed in the past. And I also just want to flag that Pfizer has an extensive experience with vaccine in the vaccine space. We supply vaccines right now to over 165 countries, and we operate one of the most sophisticated supply chain networks in the industry. And just today, we produce more than 200 million vaccine doses, and we're one of the largest providers. So we feel very confident in our ability to develop a safe and effective vaccine. And most importantly, we're doing everything we possibly can to keep our participants safe.
If I can chime into that as well, I will add, not duplicate, but I will add to what Dr. Richardson added, that in the CoVPN, or the COVID Prevention Network, and also in our work in our HIV portfolio with the HIV Vaccine Trials Network, she mentioned about reporting any changes in health status. And so I just wanted to also add for folks who are listening that those changes don't necessarily have to be observed or be attributed to the vaccine. There are any changes that may occur. That includes, headaches, temperatures, anything that impacts a person's health is asked to be reported in a diary that our study teams track and monitor and manage with the participants. The other thing I will add is that we also employ a protocol safety review team that also reviews data internally. It's another sort of tier in addition to the site level monitoring that happens with participants. There's also the protocol safety team that happens at the operations center. And then finally, I will add that to your point about empowering patients, participants to protect their rights. So we've developed a comprehensive Bill of Rights and Responsibilities, which is a document that is a part of the informed consent conversation. And it is also a document that is distributed to participants. And this document outlines all of the rights that participants have, as well as their responsibilities in participating in the clinical trials. And one of the main rights that we explain to participants is their right to terminate their participation in the study at any time for any reason. So I just wanted to highlight that as a tool that we use to support participants' rights in the process.
Can I say one more thing about safety? Just as a principle for vaccines that are given to otherwise healthy people, we consider safety the top priority. If we, at a research level, if we even have one event that is troubling, it can stop a program for years. And the first 2/3 of my research career were spent trying to unravel what happened to an RSV vaccine back in the 1960s. And that event stopped vaccine development for RSV for decades. And as we understood it better and learned how to avoid those kinds of problems, it's now allowed RSV vaccine development to go forward in a pretty robust way. And since I did mention that we went very fast from the sequence availability to the first phase 1 trial was about 65 days. I want to emphasize that as we then moved into phase 2 in May and into phase 3 by July 27th, that none of the safety assessment steps were skipped in the preclinical evaluation. And everything was staged and done in parallel so that we had evidence of immune responses before we started the first human. We had evidence of protection before we went into the phase 2, and we had evidence of safety or avoiding any safety signals before we went into the phase 3. And all those things typically are done serially, but in this case, they were all done at the same time. So the thing that was put at risk was a lot of money and a lot of time and effort. So I just want to emphasize that the safety of the vaccine for people has not been put at risk by this rapid pace that we're on.
Great, thank you so much. And one last question for the group, and I know it's been mentioned before, is how do we create a workforce that is representative of the community in which clinical trials are taking place?
Well, let me ask, by workforce,
Sure.
are you speaking of healthcare workers who
Yes,
reflect a demographic? Okay.
Yes, and so I am speaking of healthcare workers, including principal investigators, clinical research associates, community engagement personnel, the entire continuum of the clinical trials process.
I'd like to see a greater representation of African Americans in medical ethicist roles, where they actually help to assess trials and other initiatives in terms of their ethical features and dangers. I don't think there's enough of a representation there of several groups, but including African Americans, because concerns raised by African Americans may often not replicate the concerns raised by other demographic groups. And if without that, you're going to have a lacuna in terms of what we're considering when we're deciding whether a trial, going forward, the trial is ethical or not.
That's a fascinating thought.
Yeah.
How do we get there? How do we have an enriched pipeline of African American medical ethicists?
It would not be difficult, because if you consider that we have medical ethicists who actually spend the years studying it, they study philosophy and they study medicine, take PhDs, and it takes a great deal of time. We also have medical ethicists who do a 1 or 2 year fellowship, who have less training, but focused training, and are perfectly adequate in terms of assessing IRB functions, for example, or perfectly adequate in terms of sitting on a clinical board at a hospital and determining which is the ethical stance. So it would not take much time. I think what's important is to engage young professionals early in their career and have them consider this as a career path. It's perfectly compatible with other career paths. You know, you can be a surgeon and an ethicist, for example. So I think we need that. But I also think that aside from the healthcare practitioner, the IRB system that is wonderful. Everything that you've said about Dr. Richardson is true, but the problem is risk is an inherent part of medical research. You can do everything right and still have disastrous outcome. It's an ugly fact. And the problem is, this is what resonates with people. They don't remember the success of certain things like in the distant past, like polio vaccine. They don't remember that, but they will remember the trial they read about in the paper last year in which one person was harmed. So I think it's really important to, I think, make people better understand the process, you know, make it more transparent, and invite them to participate right now. And this is not a critique of the pharmaceutical industry, although I will not, you know, I will not lie. I've been very critical of the industry, but I'm not doing that now. I'm critiquing the government. It's the government laws, I think, that are not adequate here. IRBs require that you have an entire group of physicians, experts, scientists, and only one non-institutional person on the board. That's one layperson looking at 30 experts. How can that person possibly represent the interests of an entire community? How can they carry the field if they have an objection? They're simply not able to have the adequate voice that they should have. So I proposed in medical apartheid, and I proposed that these group IRBs should be composed of half community people and half researchers. And immediately some of my colleagues said, but the researchers can't, you know, the lay people won't understand the science. Your job to explain it to them. You have to explain it to the subject, right? Explain it to them. They can be your guinea pigs, you know. So, but I think that would go a long way, both toward anticipating issues before they arise and being able to address them in the research, but also in terms of ownership of the issues. I think many people who are quite logically fearful of the research system, that might help allay their fears if they knew that there were people like them who were part of vetting these studies and deciding which ones came to fruition and the form in which they came to fruition. So I think that's a really important part of reforming the IRB system.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree Go ahead, Dr. Wallace.
I just wanted to add really quickly that I agree with everything that's been said. The HIV Vaccine Trials Network has a program designed to focus on engaging African American and Latinx medical students to sort of nudge and encourage them into vaccine research.
Great.
And this program has been going on for a while. It's called the RAMP program. And I think that this program has been amazing, and it's done really amazing work to galvanize and really motivate these young medical students. But I also think that more is needed, and that we somehow need to build a broader and tighter infrastructure that supports the engagement of medical students across the HBCUs, the HBCU medical schools, and some of the other institutions that produce Black scientists and Black physicians to engage in this work. And this is a critical piece. The principal investigator role, I think, is also challenged because there have been reports that suggest that that Black PIs or Black principal investigators are funded less frequently than their white counterparts as well. And so even when I think about the representation of, increasing representation of Black investigators in clinical research, there's still this other sort of dynamic around ensuring that there's pipelines established and dedicated to support funding the science of these scientists. So I think that's an important consideration as well.
So those are very important points. And as I'll take the prerogative of the moderator to say that I hear a call for federal government assistance and industry assistance and pipeline programs that will increase the diversity of the PIs. Am I hearing that correctly, Dr. Wallace?
You are hearing that correctly, Dr. Stewart.
Okay, let the notes reiterate. Okay, so now let's move to questions.
Do you mind if I just say one other thing?
Yes, absolutely.
This has been a 40-year disappointment for me, and even though we're making progress at the level of students, I think there is way too few African Americans making it into faculty and high-level leadership positions or PI positions. And part of that, I think, is because of long-standing economic disparities and sometimes student debt. And figuring out a way to remove the debt problem will allow more medical students, more research people to emerge from African American communities. If you are in $200,000 or $300,000 of debt just for going to school, you are going to choose clinical practice, and you're not going to choose a research or academic career necessarily, as I've had the privilege to do. The other problem is, as young researchers are evolving and come to this point at the end of successful training and trying to make it into the faculty, that's where both, I think, structural and systemic racism are involved. And I make a distinction between those two terms because structural, I think, is built into the bureaucracy, and systemic is built into the implicit bias. And both of those things have to be addressed in very open and aggressive ways to overcome what's been in place for so long. So this is, if we don't have more African American leaders in academic medicine, running labs and running programs and writing grants, that it's going to be very hard to ever change the level of trust and engagement with the Black community.
And I would agree with that, and would also add to the list. I mean, certainly at Pfizer, we bring in students and interns to learn about research and importance, and that's great. But one thing that I think we haven't talked about is that there are physicians out there now today who don't know about the trials that are underway. I mean, I was talking to some of my colleagues in the National Medical Association. So if your trusted advisor is your physician and your physician isn't aware of the clinical trials that are out there, that's a barrier as well. And I think that's something that we should address. And another point I just want to make is while we've talked a lot about, you know, people of color not necessarily wanting to participate in clinical trials, there's a whole lot of people who do want to be involved and just are never asked. And so I think we want to be mindful of that as well. So we want to kind of approach it in two ways. One, make sure we are building that pipeline, engaging people, make sure our physicians of color are knowledgeable about, you know, the research that's out there so that they can be that trusted advisor talking to their people. But we also have to make sure that all physicians and all healthcare professionals and all PIs actually are asking everyone to be part of it, because there's some bias in that as well.
So that's an interesting point, and that has actually been an interest that I've had since serving as an associate dean for research some 7 or 8 years ago, is how do we create networks in which patients can be referred to clinical trials, and making sure that we have a more inclusive process of enrollment?
Yeah, it's an important question, and all of the studies point to the fact that you're more likely to participate in a trial if someone who you respect and trust tells you about it. So that gets me back to the, you know, physicians of color, you know, not having, you know, not being the PIs, not leading the studies themselves so that they could refer. You know, obviously you want to make sure you're not having any conflicts of interest there, but not even being knowledgeable about the studies and being in that pipeline. So I'm not sure how you do it other than to do it and to make sure that you have more PIs and you have more infrastructure that makes it available, but that's certainly a challenge.
I think to your point, Dr. Stewart, I think part of building that pipeline is if the communities of folks that you would imagine would be interested in participating are meaningfully engaged in research processes that are happening there locally, they're more likely to be engaged and more likely to have the information and be in the know. And so, you know, are there key opinion leaders? Are there key influencers in the local community that can be brought in and to help advise these processes? That way, as information moves forward from concept to proposal to protocol, you know, those communities can be made aware that these studies are happening because there have been key people from the community involved in moving that forward.
So that speaks to the community to the benchtop model that that at least our institution has been working on to engage our citizen scientists and helping to inform questions. And to your point, Dr. Richardson-Harriman, when you were with the All of Us program, you know, that was a key component of that program, was to involve community partners in asking the questions that were to be researched using the data from the All of Us program. So that's, I mean, it is good to see that coming full circle. Okay, so we are running short on time, so we're going to now ask each of our panelists a question specifically geared toward their talk, and we'll start with Dr. Graham. Dr. Graham, as a graduate of the Vanderbilt General Surgery Residency Program, it was good to hear you speak about your experience at Nashville General. And it is clear that your work with patients who had HIV at the time was important. So what are some of the lessons that you learned with respect to vaccines that you gained from your time at Nashville General working with HIV?
Well, when I was seeing that first AIDS patient in Tennessee came through in 1982, so that was well before we even knew that it was a virus, before it was another 2 years after that before we even had a diagnostic test. So, you know, this process with coronavirus, it seems like it's slow and it's agonizingly long to get to an answer, but with HIV, we had a lot of disease for 3 years before we even had a diagnosis and a diagnostic test. And so for HIV, it was really more of the way it motivated me to want to solve problems that of global concern that involved virus infections. Vaccines didn't really become a big part of my life until later, when I was trying to solve these problems of vaccine-enhanced disease that had occurred back in the 1960s and trying to understand those. For how vaccines affect people of color, a lot of the things we saw at Nashville General were the routine diseases of life, things that were very commonplace 150 years ago, but in which many communities suffer much less than the Black community in terms of pneumococcal disease. At the time, even some cases of pertussis and things like that, which should be commonly vaccinated for. And so I think just the lack of trust, the lack of access, the lack of engagement has led to an under-vaccination and under-appreciation and undervalued effect of vaccination in the Black community.
Great, thank you. Dr. Wallace, can you discuss the founding of the COVID Prevention Network and how it's adapted to address this pandemic? And in your opinion, what do you think that the COVID Prevention Network should be doing next to improve clinical trial diversity?
Sure. The CoVPN was established by utilizing or leveraging the expertise, the clinical trials expertise, the laboratory and statistical expertise, as well as the clinical trial sites and community engagement expertise of the existing NIAID-funded HIV networks, the AIDS Clinical Trials Group, the HIV Vaccine Trials Network, the HIV Prevention Trials Network. And these groups have long histories of engaging communities and conducting clinical research. And the HVTN specifically has obviously a long history in doing vaccine research. So our clinical trial sites are contributing to this process immensely. And our community engagement expertise and existing relationships with key communities, leveraging those relationships has been instrumental in assisting with our efforts to reach new communities and new populations and new groups to get this information out into communities. And what we can be doing going forward is to continue to expand our network. Part of the effort is having the conversations that we've been having here on this in this panel with communities, engaging people in these conversations and really helping them to move past the aversion to supporting. Part of my role is really to help ensure that folks have the information. It's the clinical trial sites that do the recruitment. So, one of the things that I'm really clear about when I talk to people is, I'm not here to recruit you to a trial. I just want to talk to you about the trials. I want to talk to you about the science. You can make a decision about trial participation later on. But in our model, in our process, if there are enough people in communities who have accurate information, then if a person who's considering participating goes and talks to what we refer to as trusted voices, their family, their friends, their clergy, their physician, as Dr. Richardson here mentioned, then those people would be informed, and those folks would have information and be able to share that information with that person as well. So it's really about meaningfully engaging these communities to be involved and informed and to be aware, but also to support eventual uptake of an approved product. There's a lot of work involved in marketing and acceptability. And so if you do a lot of that investment work on the front end, you don't have to do so much of it on the back end, playing catch up. So those are the ways I think we're moving forward for sure. Thank you.
Okay, Mrs. Washington, how do you think the efforts of Congress to combat the disparities in COVID-19 will work to close the gap in health disparities for the Black community?
Which efforts are you referring to in Congress?
sorry. So specifically efforts to make sure that we have the appropriate delivery of care to underserved populations who are more greatly affected by COVID.
Okay, how might they influence the adoption of the vaccine or
And
amenability
more
to the
generally,
vaccine?
yes, not only the vaccine, but more general health inequities that are seen in areas such as cardiovascular disease, cancer. How do they lay the framework for further consideration of combating those inequities?
Any effort to remedy and to diminish or hopefully eliminate healthcare disparities and inequities is a good thing. Any effort, any success there is going to be a success in terms of eliminating those fault lines I spoke of earlier. The reason why African Americans are succumbing in greater numbers or have a worse health profile, as everyone knows actually, is that they begin with worse health. They begin with less access to the system. They begin with less chance of having a personal physician, of being treated the same way when they present at a hospital with symptoms, of having a hospital to present to. African Americans are more likely to live in areas where hospitals have been closed, less likely to have insurance. Remedying any of these is going to increase not only their health status, but increase their ability to withstand challenges like infectious disease. So these are all very good things. The question to me is, do they go far enough? And the answer is no, because you do have to address the basic hurdles to effective health care. You do have to address the basic hurdles to effective disease prevention, but you also have to give people a sense of trust and ownership in the system, or they will not fully benefit from it. I completely agree that it would be a good thing if African Americans trusted the system and were to embrace vaccination, but the reality is right now it's an illogical request for many African Americans. I completely understand why many are reluctant to do so. And that is really our enemy here. That's what we have to eliminate. You know, the will to be, was Seneca, I think, who said, the will to be cured is an important component of being cured. And I think that for some African Americans, that will to be cured is hampered by the fact that they can't really trust the system. You know, this concept of the healthcare system as a tragic system in which you have to trust someone to whom you can't give your trust. And I think that's the channel that, it sounds kind of strange to say that can be eliminated, but that can be fixed by law, but it can be fixed by law. You know, if we were to identify and seek to correct those deficiencies in the system that separated people from care. And to summarize quickly, one route of doing that we have not fully explored is to use the carrot and the stick in terms of encouraging healthcare providers and systems to better address African American deficiencies. I think that if we were to tie physician professional advancement to a certification, to pay, if we were to tie those things to successes in this arena, we would see more success. We did it with things like encouraging physician hand washing, for example, tying surgeons' pay to whether they conformed or not. I think we need to consider doing that for the various healthcare disparities as well.
Dr. Stewart, I'm going to jump in because we have less than a minute remaining, and I just wanted to thank all of the panelists for taking the time and sharing your expertise. Thank you, Dr. Stewart. You are a marvelous moderator, and hopefully next year this time, you know, there has been more progress, more African Americans in the healthcare pipeline, healthier African Americans in our community. So thank you so much for your contributions. Really, really appreciate it. And thanks for joining us. And thank you to all the people tuning in.